A tremendous scandal has broken out in Ukraine. Military units in the country have clashed with each other in one of the best neighborhoods in the entire city of Kyiv. We're talking about the capital of Ukraine and the clash that took place at the beginning of December between the country's military intelligence and its infantry. Absolutely inconceivable events that both the Kiev regime and Western media will try to hide. Either way, because what they represent is an absolute catastrophe, not just for the Ukrainian army, but directly for the whole country. The division of Ukraine has already begun. The scavengers have already smelled blood because the Kiev regime is indeed in its final moments. Today, we're going to see exactly what has happened. How is it possible that in the middle of the war, top-level military units are basically dividing up territory? What are the consequences, especially for ordinary people? What does this mean globally and for Ukraine? Above all, stay until the end of this video to see how. Ukrainian sources themselves say that this is only the beginning of the end. Or in other words, something that may seem simple, but actually is not at all. The confrontation between soldiers confirms the fall of an entire country. I'm Liu Sivaya, a Donbass war correspondent and geopolitical analyst. Subscribe to this channel to stay up to date with the latest international news and, of course, the very latest updates on the Ukrainian conflict. Facts that will never appear in Western media. Let's begin. We begin as usual. Absolutely inconceivable events have recently taken place, particularly at the beginning of December, in one of the most powerful, most important, and wealthiest districts of the capital of Ukraine. We are talking about Concha Zaspe, which is something like, speaking in Spanish terms, the equivalent of the Salamanca district in the city of Kiev. That is, it's the place where the greatest power and the largest amounts of money are concentrated. There, on the grounds of the sanatorium, Jov, which translates from Ukrainian as October, a pretty typical name from the Soviet Union, because the October Revolution was very present at that time. Now it is being distributed directly among Ukrainian military personnel of the highest level. And this, in fact, not only practically announces to us the definitive fall of the Kiev regime, but also tells us about war crimes that Ukraine is committing in broad daylight, and above all, about the real state of things. On one hand, at the front, and on the other hand, within what is the Ukrainian political society, which of course will have a tremendous amount of influence on Ukrainian society in general. Now let's go straight to the details. The confrontation has been led by intelligence military personnel, whether those from the main Directorate of Intelligence, those who follow the orders of Mr. Vudinov, and regular Ukrainian soldiers. Actually, not really. One of the infantry units, which, by the way, is located in the capital of Ukraine. Instead of being at the front right now, here's a rather curious fact. Ukrainian reserves are running out, and things at the front are getting worse and worse. They'll explain this to us soon. One of the deputies who talks the most about the topic of Ukraine, who is actually directly involved with military intelligence. But it turns out that while the front is falling apart, which is basically a reality, military personnel are inside the Ukrainian capital. Not only are they living peacefully without having to face any kind of danger, but they are also engaging in criminal activities. Directly because the prosecutor's office is already fully involved in these events, they have even taken hostages from the infantry unit that has been stationed in the territory of this sanatorium. Well, and not only that, they've been shooting everywhere. Ultimately, what happened there was absolute chaos, which of course is related to the overall situation. And now we're going to go into even more detail. Which military unit was there, in what location, why, and what caused this confrontation? But before anything else, it's very important, now that we've seen some details of what happened, to look at the context itself. Because, first of all, this is due to the fact that the front can't withstand the pressure any longer. Also, the political leadership of Ukraine is feeling the pressure as well. In the United States, they have set out to achieve peace no matter what and at any cost. It seems that it has become one of Donald Trump's personal goals. This is already being noticed in Vancouver. That is to say, the Kiev regime is actually going through the same chaos that has already taken over almost the entire Ukrainian front. We have been analyzing these events in detail in one of the latest videos on the channel. Right now, Russia is making huge advances in Zaporizhzhia, among many other directions on the front where multiple advances by that country's army are taking place. Ultimately, the person who has best defined this situation has undoubtedly been one of the most prominent deputies in recent times in the Ukrainian Rada, that is, the Parliament of Ukraine. Mariana Besukler.
I will point out that Pokrovsk is practically captured already, and Mirnorod is completely surrounded. The Russians are nearing Zaporizhia and entered Kostiantynivka earlier. We still have gaps in our air defense that allow Russian drones to enter through certain fixed corridors from the west. Things keep getting worse. Syrskyi remains in charge. The general staff remains unreformed, troop audits are minimal, and the National Security Council is still in control. Someone involved in corruption investigations, and a person from the head of the president's office, who was dismissed amid scandals. The number of deserters from the CTH has surpassed the number of our army before Russia's full-scale invasion. There won't be peace for years. Many people, I should mention, mistakenly believe in peace processes. They continue to believe in the CTCU, but they avoid the CTCU or, upon entering the system, try to make arrangements with the CTCU in different ways. The minority fights and still schemes. He acts out of conviction, but I don't blame anyone. Now, people need to be guided. They need to trust the system, understand their path, and know that they won't be sent to their deaths. For a sideways glance or a post on Facebook, for example, is military justice already needed since yesterday? Terms of service search with Chesed Chi, reduction of barracks, increase in the combat component, elimination of unnecessary and fake units, increase in military pay through auditing and redistribution, digitization of combat orders, analysis for oneself and the enemy, not for the colonel of the tactical operations unit, real development of the corps of sergeants, psychological support in combat, etc. There is much, much more. In general, with such management, the army fights for itself on its own, maintaining resistance in a decentralized way. Now, finally having some political renewal, undoubtedly the restart of the president's office. We need a military reform to break out of the vicious circle and not end up becoming a hospice for good. Syrskyi must resign, and the leadership of the troops should be taken over by new commanders with a complete reassessment.
As you can see, the deputy in question speaks absolutely openly about the catastrophe that is happening at the front. At this very moment, the armed forces of Ukraine are calling for the dismissal of the head of the Ukrainian army, Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi, whom they hold responsible for all the misfortune that Ukraine is experiencing at the front. And while we have this in the background, that is the absolute worst catastrophe in military terms, the imminent collapse of the Ukrainian defense, which is already happening right now in more than one direction. The soldiers from the main and most powerful units, as well as those belonging to the military elite of the country, that is, the command, that is, the Ukrainian military intelligence, are involved in absolutely shameful acts that the Kiev regime is doing everything possible to cover up. This, of course, corresponds to the distribution of power and money that is taking place right now in Ukraine and that we have seen and will continue to see. Of course, in much more detail on my private Telegram channel, where the latest information from the most reliable of my sources is now appearing, who are directly located, whether in Moscow or in Ukraine, regarding what is happening in that country. That is, through previous military pressure and direct pressure from the United States. The fall of the Kyiv regime becomes practically imminent. And because of that, Ukrainian assets are basically left without an owner. Or, well, right now they do have owners, but they are owners who don't convince all the powerful people or all the elites of Ukraine equally. So now the maximum chaos is beginning, both politically and, as we can already see, practically militarily in the country, where those who have the most power, and above all, those who have the ability to use force at their discretion, are trying to get the biggest and best share. That is, to get the biggest piece of this pie that Ukraine represents, especially in monetary terms. In this sense, of course, it's no coincidence that the main Directorate of Intelligence Military, Budanov's protégés, have come face to face with each other. That a great quantity of how much they faced, a large amount, that a great quantity. And well, 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 and okay, and okay, and okay. A tremendous shopping mall, for example, that could be built in its place once things calm down and the war is over. Because indeed, now it seems the Ukrainian elites are seeing it more and more clearly. The important thing is that something of Ukraine remains, even if it's just by then, even if it's just the capital of the country. And that's where the division could already begin. Well, actually, the division has already started. In theory, the rights to the sanatorium in question belong to both units that have been involved in the spectacle, which has the entire Kiev regime trembling right now. On one hand, the Ukrainian infantry, specifically military unit A4005, had signed a contract with the sanatorium to station their soldiers there. But wait, doesn't this directly constitute a war crime? I mean, using an initially civilian target and turning it into a military one. Placing military equipment there, or military units, or both, as in this case, turns it into a purely military target. Then, a bomb from the Russian Federation hits there, and Zelensky goes all over Europe saying that Russia has attacked a sanatorium where they should be treating the military, poor Ukrainian children, which we can already see. What would happen if that actually occurred? Whether it has anything to do with reality or not. However, I wasn't Buddha. Therefore, their army, in the form of military intelligence, had already made arrangements for this same territory with another set of Ukrainian elites. So, in theory, they claim it with all the logic in the world. Do you get the irony? And also, in these last years, during the course of the war, they have accumulated vast amounts of power, as well as vast amounts of weaponry. Ultimately, military intelligence has always been quite a bit above regular soldiers. So they simply entered the territory of the sanatorium in question to carry out justice. By their own hand, they have detained and even held people, meaning they've taken them as hostages. As far as we know, at least 10 Ukrainian soldiers were severely beaten by them. But it seems they were eventually released. Anyway, they occupied the territory of the sanatorium, and not only that, they also received help from the GBR, which is something like the Bureau of Investigations of Ukraine, which in theory should be pursuing, among other things, the country's biggest criminals. But it seems they actually prefer to support them. I mean, quite the opposite, since they arrived and started making lists of everything that was in the sanatorium, with the intention of, in fact, privatizing things for themselves, for Budanov and his associates. The most interesting part begins, however, afterwards, since Sears himself, that is, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine. Upon learning of this incident, he sends his second-in-command to try to clarify things, to whom Budanov, once he actually arrives at the scene, they send him straight to hell. We give orders and command here. This territory is ours by law because we've decided it. Ultimately, things in Ukraine are really getting tough now. Just imagine to what degree. Since the country's army, and not even as a whole, but its different units, using the force they actually have, are dividing it up as if it were a pie. Meanwhile, the Kiev regime can't do much about it. The prosecutor general's office has already gotten involved in the matter, but even now, we're talking about an incident that happened at the beginning of December. So, it's been at least a week, and they still haven't clarified who owns the sanatorium or who will end up staying there in the end. And the Ukrainian infantry keeps showing those absolutely criminal contracts, and not just within Ukraine, but even at the international level. But of course, the West won't say absolutely anything about it. And even less will the Kiev regime itself, which in theory supports Budanov, be able to do anything. But besides, they're not in a position to talk, much less to whether the government did it, whether it was done, whatever. Whether the government of Kiev has proven it, The government has proven that the government did it. The fact proves the fact that the government did it. Kyiv has proven that the government of Kiev has done the test. The government of Kiev has absolutely nothing to do with it. It is the one who has been coordinating this entire territory up until now. That is, trying to maintain that unstable balance between all the parties involved in the distribution of power within Ukraine. And if, in fact, for that, they even had full Western support? Or do you really think that now Donald Trump is confronting Zelensky for some unknown reason? About corruption? Or is he rather using corruption to achieve his own goals? Which right now isn't exactly clear why. Maybe, I wonder, it has something to do with the Caribbean? It could mean putting a definitive end to the Ukrainian conflict. Whatever the case, the matter seems clear, even if it's unbelievable. To the fullest extent, isn't it supposed that there are no more soldiers in Ukraine? They're dragging even the youngest boys in the country straight to the front lines, sending them in with the foot soldiers. Of course, it's a bloodbath that doesn't stop, and that the Kiev regime doesn't want to end under any circumstances. But in the meantime, the real soldiers, the ones who studied and trained for this, what they're really doing is deciding who ends up keeping what amount of money or territory. But the worst of this situation is still yet to come. And it's not just me saying it. That's what another member of the Ukrainian Rada says, Mrs. Skarajot, who, by the way, is now under investigation by the anti-corruption agency. Let me remind you that ultimately it is still in Ukraine, but it's under American control.
We've already seen it. We've already been through it. After 2014, all the contract killings. We remember perfectly well how the major elite special units from one of the most famous units in Ukraine were stealing, right? We remember the takeovers of houses, we remember the takeovers of whatever. Get ready, because after the war, what we had will increase 20 or even 30 times. And also keep in mind that every Ukrainian today has something somewhere. Some have a big hiding place, others a small one. Someone brought grenades from the front and gave them away. Someone was given ammunition, someone a pistol, somewhere they got a trophy, and someone else a rifle. And now people are armed to the teeth. That's why the post-war period will be even more complicated than the war period. We have to prepare for this, and I hope that somehow you'll help us deal with it. Our Western partners, including the United States of America. And I hope that somehow the law enforcement system can handle all of this. Otherwise, we'll have total chaos and complete disorder in the streets and everywhere.
You see, the Congresswoman made it very clear. The worst is yet to come, since all those who have received and still possess huge amounts of weapons. Once things in Ukraine become more and more chaotic, that is, as the country's defeat gets closer and closer, well, indeed, they will step forward to grab as big a piece of the pie as possible. Maybe this is precisely one of the reasons for now. The Congresswoman in question, who has recently been one of the most critical of the Kiev regime, is being investigated for alleged corruption. Although, watch out, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, in theory, wants exactly that same Congresswoman. That is, the complete fall of the Kiev regime, or at least the capitulation of Ukraine, and therefore the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. These could be two entirely unrelated events. Congresswoman, lately you have been one of the most critical of the Kiev regime, at least regarding the capitulation. Ukraine criticism. Congresswoman, lately you have been critical of the Kiev regime, or at least of Ukraine, the Kiev regime in this regard, especially about Ukraine's capitulation. Congresswoman Foro had a bit of a mess, as she had tens, if not directly hundreds of millions of hryvnias in bitcoins. It would be wise to separate her statements from her supposed integrity as a politician and person. Of course, regardless of whether the statements that Ms. Karajos faces are political in nature or not, what she's saying is a fact, as clear as day. Ukraine is already going through its worst moments right now, but this is by no means the end, since the worst is definitely yet to come. And what about all this corruption that the Western media have been covering up for so long? Once the Kiev regime falls, and once it becomes absolutely clear that Ukraine has already capitulated or is about to do so and will not receive a single cent more of Western aid. In terms of weaponry, boom, well, in fact, that's precisely when the worst will begin, because that's when the vulture elites will start ruthlessly tearing the country apart. A tragedy that at this point, no one knows whether it can be avoided or not. In fact, most likely, at best, it could only be somewhat alleviated. And this will depend on how quickly the Kiev regime signs the final peace agreement, although I'm afraid that this moment is still too far away from happening.